Grace Mitchell serves coffee with a polite smile, just like she has every morning for the past 3 months at Sullivan's diner. At 52, she looks like any other small-town waitress trying to make ends meet after losing her husband. But when officers Blake Harrison and Danny Peterson swagger through the door demanding free meals and threatening the business owner, they have no idea who they're really dealing with. What starts as a simple request for courtesy quickly spirals into verbal abuse, threats of arrest, and a display of corruption that would make your blood boil. Blake calls Grace worthless, tells her she's never accomplished anything meaningful, and that nobody would miss her if she disappeared tomorrow. He forces her to clean up messes they deliberately create, threatens to destroy Frank's business, and turns the entire diner into his personal theater of intimidation. But Grace isn't just any waitress. She's been hiding a secret that's about to turn these corrupt cops' world upside down. When Blake finally pushes her too far and reaches for his handcuffs, Grace does something that makes his face go white with terror. She pulls out her phone and dials a number that will change everything. The voice that answers makes Blake realize he just made the biggest mistake of his career. What happens next will shock you, satisfy your sense of justice, and prove that sometimes karma comes in the most unexpected package. This is the story of how 2 bullies with badges learned that the quiet woman they chose to torment wasn't nearly as powerless as she appeared. The morning sun barely crept through the greasy windows of Sullivan's diner when Grace Mitchell tied her apron strings for another day of work. At 52, she moved with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen enough of life to know that respect wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned. Her graying hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her hands, though weathered from months of carrying plates and wiping tables, still held the steady confidence of someone who once wielded a gavel. Nobody in this small town knew who Grace really was. To them, she was just another waitress trying to make ends meet. That's exactly how she wanted it. Frank Sullivan emerged from the kitchen, his face already showing the strain that had become his constant companion over the past few months. At 45, Frank had owned this diner for nearly 2 decades, watching it become the heart of the community. Lately, though, that heart had been under attack. "Grace, we need to talk," Frank whispered, glancing nervously toward the front door. "They're coming again today." Grace paused in her coffee preparation, noting the tremor in Frank's voice. In her previous life, she would have immediately recognized the signs of someone being systematically intimidated. Now, as a waitress in this small diner, she was experiencing it firsthand. "The same 2 officers?" she asked quietly. Frank nodded, his hands shaking slightly as he arranged pastries in the display case. "Blake Harrison and Danny Peterson. They've been making their rounds to every business on this street. Coffee shop, hardware store, even the flower shop. Everyone's paying. Paying for what? Protection, they call it. But we both know what it really is." Frank's voice dropped even lower. "Grace, I've been running this place for 20 years. I've served 3 mayors, 2 police chiefs, and hundreds of good cops. These 2, they're different. They're dangerous." Grace had suspected something was wrong for weeks. She'd noticed how Frank's demeanor changed whenever certain patrol cars drove by. She'd seen the way other business owners on the street looked nervously over their shoulders. Most telling of all, she'd witnessed the fear in people's eyes when Blake Harrison and Danny Peterson walked into establishments. "How much are they asking for?" Grace inquired, her judicial mind automatically cataloging evidence. $500 a month. Cash only. They said if I don't pay, they'll find reasons to shut me down. Health code violations, noise complaints, loitering issues. They've got it all figured out. The bell above the diner door chimed, and Frank's face went pale. Grace didn't need to turn around to know who had just walked in. The sudden silence that fell over the handful of early morning customers told her everything she needed to know. Officer Blake Harrison strode in like he owned the place, his 34-year-old frame filling out his uniform with the kind of bulk that came from spending more time at the donut shop than the gym. His partner, Danny Peterson, followed close behind. At 28, Danny had the eager look of someone still trying to prove himself, still hungry for the power that came with the badge. "Well, well," Blake announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Look who's open for business bright and early." Grace turned slowly, her server's smile practiced and professional. "Good morning, officers. Coffee." Blake looked her up and down with undisguised contempt. "Yeah, coffee. And make it fresh. None of that burnt garbage you've been serving." "Of course," Grace replied evenly, reaching for the coffee pot. She'd made fresh coffee less than 10 minutes ago, but she wasn't about to argue. Danny slid into the booth across from Blake, his eyes scanning the diner like he was casing the joint. "Busy place you got here, Frank," he called out to the owner, who was trying to make himself invisible behind the counter. "We do our best," Frank replied weakly. Grace approached their table with 2 steaming cups of coffee, setting them down with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been waitressing for months. "Can I get you gentlemen anything to eat this morning?" Blake leaned back in his seat, studying Grace with the kind of look that made her skin crawl. "You know what, waitress? I think we deserve a little something extra today. Don't you think, Danny?" Danny grinned, catching on immediately. "Absolutely. We work hard protecting this community, keeping the streets safe, making sure businesses like this one stay operational." The emphasis on that last word wasn't lost on anyone in the diner. Grace felt the other customers shift uncomfortably in their seats. An elderly man at the counter suddenly found his newspaper fascinating. A young couple in the corner booth started whispering nervously. "What did you have in mind?" Grace asked, maintaining her professional composure. Blake gestured broadly at the menu board. "Everything looks good. Real good. But you know what? I'm thinking we shouldn't have to pay for it. Community service and all that." Grace's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In her 25 years on the federal bench, she'd seen every kind of corruption, every abuse of power imaginable. But experiencing it firsthand as an ordinary citizen was different. The helplessness was infuriating. "I'm sorry, but that's not how we do business here," she said calmly. The temperature in the diner seemed to drop 10 degrees. Blake's easy smile disappeared, replaced by something much more dangerous. "Excuse me." He leaned forward, his voice taking on an edge. "Did you just tell me no? I explained that we charge for our food. Same as any restaurant." Danny laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Blake, I think this waitress has an attitude problem." Blake stood up slowly, his 6-foot frame towering over Grace. "You know what I think, Danny? I think this waitress doesn't understand how things work around here." Grace held her ground, though every instinct told her to step back. "I understand perfectly. You're police officers, and I'm a waitress. That doesn't entitle you to free food." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Frank made a small, strangled sound from behind the counter. The other customers seemed to hold their collective breath. Blake's face flushed red. "Entitle us? Lady, do you have any idea what we do for this community? Do you know how many criminals we keep off these streets? How many lowlifes we deal with so you can serve coffee in peace?" "I appreciate your service," Grace replied, her voice steady. "But appreciation and free meals are 2 different things." Danny stood up as well, flanking Grace. "Blake, I think we've got a problem here. This woman is being uncooperative. Suspicious, even." "Suspicious how?" Grace asked. Blake circled around her slowly, like a predator sizing up prey. "Well, for starters, you're new in town. Nobody knows much about you. You keep to yourself. Don't socialize much. That raises questions." "Questions about what?" "About what you might be hiding," Danny chimed in. "About why someone would come to a small town like this and take a job like this. About what you might be running from." Grace felt a chill run down her spine, not from fear, but from recognition. She'd seen this exact playbook before, from the other side of the courtroom. The manufactured suspicion. The fishing expedition. The way they were building a case out of thin air. "I moved here after my husband died," she said simply. "I needed work, and Frank needed help." Blake snorted. "Convenient story. But you know what? I don't buy it." He turned to address the entire diner, his voice carrying to every corner. "Folks, we've got a situation here. This woman is acting suspicious, being uncooperative with law enforcement. That's the kind of behavior that makes us wonder what someone might be hiding." The elderly man at the counter looked up nervously. The young couple started gathering their things, clearly wanting to leave, but afraid to make any sudden movements. Frank finally found his voice. "Officers, please. Grace is a good employee. She's never caused any trouble." Blake whirled on Frank. "Nobody asked you, Frank. But now that you mention it, maybe we should talk about the kind of employees you're hiring. The kind of establishment you're running." The threat was unmistakable. Frank's face went ashen. Grace stepped forward slightly, drawing Blake's attention back to her. Something in her judicial training wouldn't let her stand by and watch Frank be intimidated. "If you have concerns about my behavior, I'm happy to address them," she said. "But threatening Mr. Sullivan's business because I won't give you free food is inappropriate." Blake's eyes widened in disbelief. Inappropriate? Did you just tell me I'm being inappropriate? I'm suggesting that there might be better ways to handle this situation. Danny laughed again, this time with genuine amusement. Blake, this waitress thinks she can tell us how to do our job. Blake moved closer to Grace, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. Let me explain something to you, waitress. In this town, we decide what's appropriate. We decide what's suspicious. We decide who gets to run a business and who doesn't. He gestured around the diner. You see all these people? They understand how things work. They show respect. They show appreciation. But you? You think you're different. Grace met his gaze steadily. I think I'm a customer service employee doing my job. Your job, Blake repeated slowly, is to serve us. Your job is to make sure we're happy. Your job is to show the proper respect to the people who keep this community safe. The word respect came out like a curse. Grace recognized the type immediately. Someone who confused fear with respect, who used authority as a weapon instead of a responsibility. I respect the badge, she said carefully. I respect what it represents. But, Blake prompted, but I also respect myself. The silence that followed was deafening. Frank looked like he might faint. The other customers seemed frozen in place. Blake's face went through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous purple. Danny, I think we need to have a serious conversation with this woman about respect. Danny nodded eagerly. Absolutely. Maybe somewhere more private. Grace felt the situation escalating beyond anything she'd experienced in her months of undercover observation. These officers weren't just corrupt, they were unstable. Dangerous. Frank stepped forward desperately. Officers, please. I'll comp your meals. On the house. No charge. Blake never took his eyes off Grace. Too late for that, Frank. Your employee here has made this personal. He pulled out his handcuffs, the metal catching the morning light streaming through the diner windows. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to turn around and put your hands behind your back. On what charges? Grace asked, disturbing the peace, interfering with police business, being suspicious in a public place. Blake's smile returned cold and predatory. We'll figure out the rest down at the station. Grace looked around the diner at the frightened faces of ordinary citizens watching their local police abuse their power. She thought about Frank's shaking hands and sleepless nights. She thought about all the other business owners paying protection money to these two thugs. Most of all, she thought about why she'd taken this job in the first place, to understand what it felt like to be powerless in the face of corruption. Now she knew. Turn around, Blake ordered, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Grace remained still for a moment, her mind racing through options. She could reveal who she was right now. End this charade with a few words. But something told her this wasn't over yet. These officers needed to show their true colors completely. I'd like to call someone, she said. Danny laughed. You'll get your phone call after we book you, lady. That's how this works. Actually, Grace said quietly, that's not how it works. Blake's hand moved to his weapon. What did you say? The diner held its breath. Grace Mitchell, retired federal judge, looked at officers Blake Harrison and Danny Peterson and made a decision that would change all their lives forever. I said that's not how it works. And I think it's time someone reminded you how it's supposed to work. Blake Harrison's face twisted into something ugly as Grace's words hung in the air. The hand resting on his weapon twitched, and for a moment, the entire diner seemed to hold its breath. Danny Peterson stepped closer, his younger face eager for whatever was about to unfold. Lady, you just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic life, Blake snarled, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the silent diner. Grace stood perfectly still, her hands at her sides, her expression calm despite the storm she could see building in Blake's eyes. 25 years of facing down hardened criminals in federal court had taught her that showing fear only fed the beast. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. Now! Blake's voice cracked like a whip. I'm not resisting, Grace said evenly. I'm simply asking for clarification on the charges. Danny let out a bark of laughter. Charges? Blake, this old broad thinks she's a lawyer or something. Blake's smile returned, but it was the kind of smile that made the temperature drop. Oh, you want charges? I'll give you charges. He began pacing in front of Grace like a prosecutor addressing a jury, except his jury was a diner full of terrified customers. Let's start with obstruction of justice. You interfered with official police business by refusing to cooperate with our investigation. What investigation? Grace asked. The investigation into suspicious activity at this establishment. Blake shot back without missing a beat. We received reports of unusual behavior, and when we came to investigate, you became hostile and uncooperative. Grace felt a familiar rage building in her chest. She'd spent decades watching criminals twist the law to serve their purposes, but experiencing it as a victim was entirely different. What reports? From whom? Danny stepped forward, his chest puffed out with false authority. We don't have to explain our sources to you, lady. That's confidential police information. Blake nodded approvingly at his partner. That's right. And speaking of suspicious behavior, let's talk about how you've been acting since we walked in here. He began circling Grace slowly, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a sermon. First, you were nervous when we arrived. Jumpy. That's classic guilty behavior right there. I wasn't nervous, Grace replied calmly. Don't interrupt me. Blake roared, causing several customers to jump in their seats. I'm not finished talking. The elderly man at the counter made a move toward the door, but Danny immediately turned on him. Where do you think you're going, Pops? Nobody leaves until we're done here. The old man froze, his hand still on the door handle. I was just going to work. Sit down, Danny ordered. All of you stay right where you are. This is now an active police investigation. Grace watched this display of power with a mixture of professional fascination and personal disgust. These weren't peace officers, they were bullies with badges, and they were putting on a show for everyone in the diner. Blake continued his slow circle around Grace. Where was I? Oh yes, your suspicious behavior. Nervous when we arrived, argumentative when we asked simple questions, uncooperative when we tried to investigate. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the broken capillaries in his nose, the yellowed teeth behind his smirk. But you want to know what's really suspicious? The way you talk. The way I talk. Yeah, you don't talk like a waitress. You talk like you think you're better than everyone else. Like you think you're smarter than us. His voice rose with each word. Like you think you can tell police officers how to do their job. Danny nodded enthusiastically. Blake's right. I noticed it too. This isn't how normal people talk to cops. Grace realized she was being pulled into a trap that these two had probably set dozens of times before. Every word she said would be used against her, twisted to fit whatever narrative they were building. Blake suddenly grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to leave bruises. You know what I think? I think you're hiding something. I think you came to this town running from something, and now you're trying to blend in by playing the innocent waitress. He gestured to Frank, who was standing behind the counter looking like he might collapse. And I think Frank here knows exactly what you're hiding. That's why he hired you. That's why he's been protecting you. I'm not protecting anyone, Frank stammered. Grace is just an employee. She needed work, I needed help. Shut up, Frank. Blake snapped. Nobody asked you. He turned his attention back to Grace, his grip on her arm tightening. But you know what really pisses me off? The disrespect. The complete and total disrespect you've shown us from the moment we walked in here. Blake began addressing the entire diner again, his voice booming off the walls. Folks, what you're witnessing here is exactly what's wrong with this country. People who think they don't have to show respect to law enforcement. People who think they can just do whatever they want. He shook Grace's arm roughly. This woman thinks she's special. Thinks she doesn't have to follow the same rules as everyone else. Danny picked up the narrative seamlessly. It's an attitude problem, Blake. She thinks she's better than us. Better than us. Blake repeated, his voice rising to a shout. Did you hear that, folks? This waitress, this nobody who probably never accomplished anything meaningful in her entire life, thinks she's better than the men who risk their lives to protect this community. Grace felt every eye in the diner on her. She saw the mixture of fear and pity in their faces. They wanted to help her, but they were too afraid of becoming targets themselves. Blake released her arm and stepped back, spreading his arms wide like a performer on stage. Let me tell you something about respect, waitress. Respect isn't something you get to pick and choose when to give. Respect for law enforcement is what keeps society functioning. He pointed an accusatory finger at her. And when someone like you refuses to show that respect, it sends a message. It tells criminals that it's okay to challenge authority. It tells thugs and lowlifes that they don't have to obey the law. Danny nodded sagely. She's basically encouraging criminal behavior by acting this way. Exactly. Blake slammed his fist on the nearest table, making the sugar dispenser jump. This kind of attitude creates chaos. It undermines everything we stand for. Grace watched this performance with growing disgust. She'd seen similar tactics in her courtroom. Criminals trying to justify their actions by claiming to be victims, by wrapping themselves in false righteousness. Blake wasn't finished. You know what really gets me? We came in here peacefully. We were polite. We asked for a simple courtesy, a free meal as a gesture of appreciation for our service. That's not unreasonable. He began pacing again, working himself into a frenzy. Police officers all over this country get free coffee, free meals, discounts at businesses. You know why? Because smart business owners understand that having a good relationship with law enforcement is good for everyone. Danny joined in the pacing, the two of them moving around Grace like sharks circling prey. It's just common sense. You treat us well, we make sure your business stays safe. But not this one, Blake continued, gesturing dismissively at Grace. This one thinks she's too good for common courtesy. This one thinks she can lecture us about appropriate behavior. He stopped pacing and faced her directly. So let me ask you something, waitress. What makes you so special? What makes you think you don't have to show the same respect that every other decent person in this town shows us? Grace met his gaze steadily. I believe respect is earned, not demanded. The words seemed to hit Blake like a physical blow. His face went through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous purple. Earned? He repeated in a voice barely above a whisper. Earn! He exploded into motion, grabbing Grace by both shoulders and shaking her. Lady, I've earned more respect in my 10 years wearing this badge than you'll earn in your entire worthless life. Frank finally found his voice. Officer, please. You're hurting her. Blake whirled on Frank with such violence that the diner owner stumbled backward into the coffee machine. I told you to shut up, Frank. One more word and we'll be having a conversation about health code violations, fire safety issues, and whether you deserve to keep this place open. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Frank's face went white as he realized his business, his livelihood, his legacy, was being held hostage. Blake turned back to Grace, his breathing heavy with rage. You want to talk about earning respect? Let me tell you what I've done to earn mine. He began counting on his fingers. I've arrested drug dealers who were poisoning kids in this community. I've stopped domestic abusers from beating their wives. I've chased down armed robbers who were terrorizing elderly people. His voice rose with each accomplishment. I've been shot at, spit on, cursed at, and threatened. I've missed my kids' birthday parties and my anniversary dinners to keep the streets safe. Danny nodded solemnly. Blake's a hero. We both are. That's right, Blake continued. We're heroes. And this is the thanks we get? Attitude from some washed-up waitress, who probably never did anything more important than pour coffee. He leaned in close to Grace's face. Let me tell you something about your pathetic little life, lady. Nobody cares about you. Nobody would miss you if you disappeared tomorrow. You're nobody. You're nothing. The words were designed to break her, to reduce her to tears and pleas for mercy. Grace had heard similar attacks from defendants trying to intimidate witnesses, from lawyers trying to rattle her composure. But Blake wasn't finished. Look around this diner. Look at these people. They're all thinking the same thing, that you should have just kept your mouth shut and showed some respect. He addressed the customers directly. Isn't that right, folks? Doesn't this woman owe us a little courtesy for all we do to protect you? The silence was deafening. The elderly man stared at his coffee cup. The young couple examined their hands. Nobody wanted to get involved. Blake smiled triumphantly. See, even they know you're wrong. He pulled out his handcuffs again, letting them dangle from his finger like a threat. But you know what the real problem is? It's not just disrespect. It's the fact that you think you're smart enough to tell us how to do our job. Danny laughed mockingly. A waitress trying to educate police officers. That's rich. Blake nodded. It really is. Here's a woman who probably barely finished high school, telling trained law enforcement professionals how they should behave. Grace felt the insult like a physical slap, not because it hurt her personally, but because she realized how many other innocent people had been subjected to this same treatment. I graduated summa cum laude from, she began, then stopped herself. Blake's eyes lit up with predatory glee. From where? From waitressing school. Danny burst out laughing. Summa cum laude. Did you hear that, Blake? This waitress thinks she went to college. Blake joined in the laughter. Oh, this is perfect. Not only is she disrespectful, she's delusional too. He turned to address the diner again. Folks, we've got ourselves a real situation here. A mentally unstable individual who's creating disturbances and living in a fantasy world. Grace realized she'd made a mistake. In her anger, she'd almost revealed information that would have blown her cover. But these two were so consumed with their own performance that they'd missed the significance of her slip. Blake was still laughing. Summa cum laude. That's a good one. I bet you were valedictorian too, right? Probably had scholarship offers from Harvard. Actually, Grace started, then caught herself again. Actually? Danny prompted. Actually what? Let me guess, you were going to be a doctor, but life got in the way. Blake slapped his knee. Or maybe a lawyer. Yeah, I bet that's it. You were going to be a big-shot lawyer, but instead you're serving coffee to people who actually made something of themselves. The irony was so thick Grace could taste it. She was standing here being mocked for achievements that far exceeded anything these two had ever accomplished, by men who were using their positions to terrorize innocent people. Blake's laughter died suddenly, replaced by cold anger. You know what? I'm tired of this conversation. I'm tired of listening to some nobody waitress try to convince us she's something special. He grabbed Grace's wrist and began forcing it behind her back. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice, disturbing the peace, and resisting arrest. I haven't resisted anything, Grace pointed out. You're resisting right now, Blake snarled, twisting her arm harder. See how easy that is? Frank stepped forward desperately. Officers, please. I'll pay whatever you want. Just leave Grace alone. Blake paused in his arrest procedure, a calculating look crossing his face. Whatever we want. Frank nodded quickly. Yes. Name your price. Blake released Grace's arm and turned to face Frank fully. You know what, Frank? I think you've been part of the problem all along. He began walking toward the counter, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. See, I think you hired this woman specifically because she's trouble. I think you wanted someone who would cause problems for law enforcement. Frank's face went pale. No, that's not true. I just needed help with the diner. Really? Blake leaned against the counter, his posture casual but his eyes deadly serious. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're running some kind of operation here. Danny caught on immediately. Yeah, Blake. Now that you mention it, this place does seem suspicious. Blake nodded thoughtfully. Suspicious employees, cash-only business, customers who don't want to cooperate with police investigations. He gestured around the diner. I'm thinking we need to take a much closer look at what's really going on here. Frank's hands began shaking visibly. Officers, please. This is just a diner. I serve food, people eat it, they pay for it. That's all. Is it? Blake asked. Because I'm starting to wonder if there might be other activities happening here. Off-the-books activities. Grace watched this extortion attempt with professional fascination and personal revulsion. These officers had turned intimidation into an art form. Blake pulled out a small notebook and began writing. Let's see. We've got suspicious employee behavior, an uncooperative business owner, possible unreported income. He looked up at Frank with mock concern. You know, Frank, when we start investigating a business, we usually find all sorts of violations. Health code, fire code, zoning issues, tax problems. Danny nodded gravely. It's amazing how many problems surface once we start looking. Frank's voice came out as barely a whisper. What do you want? Blake smiled, the expression of a predator who'd cornered his prey. What do I want? I want respect, Frank. I want recognition for all the hard work Danny and I do to keep this community safe. He closed his notebook with a snap. And I want people to understand that when they hire troublemakers like your waitress here, there are consequences. Grace had seen enough. These officers weren't just corrupt, they were sadistic. They were enjoying every moment of Frank's terror, every second of her humiliation. Let me make a phone call, she said quietly. Blake turned back to her with genuine amusement. A phone call? Lady, you're about to be arrested for multiple crimes. You'll get your phone call at the station. Actually, Grace said, her voice taking on a different quality, I think I'll make it now. Something in her tone made Blake pause. For the first time since entering the diner, he looked uncertain. What did you say? Grace straightened to her full height, and suddenly the frightened waitress was gone. In her place stood someone who had commanded courtrooms, who had stared down federal prosecutors and defense attorneys, who had sentenced hardened criminals to decades in prison. I said I'm going to make a phone call. Right now. The change in her demeanor was so complete, so dramatic, that everyone in the diner felt it. Blake took an involuntary step backward. You don't give orders here, lady. Grace smiled, and it was nothing like the polite service smile she'd been wearing all morning. This smile belonged to someone who had just realized that playtime was over. Officer Harrison, I think it's time you learned exactly who you've been talking to for the past 20 minutes. Blake's face went white as he realized she knew his name, his full name, something he'd never mentioned during their encounter. Grace reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her cell phone. One phone call. That's all this is going to take. Blake Harrison stared at Grace's phone like it was a loaded weapon. Something had shifted in the air of the diner. Something that made his confident swagger falter for the first time all morning. "Put that phone away," he ordered, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. Grace ignored him completely, scrolling through her contacts with the calm efficiency of someone who had made countless important calls under pressure. She hadn't planned for this moment, hadn't expected to reveal herself this way. But these two officers had pushed her past the point of maintaining her cover. Danny stepped forward nervously. "Blake, maybe we should just—" "Shut up, Danny." Blake's eyes never left Grace's phone. "Lady, I'm warning you. Put that phone down and put your hands behind your back." Grace found the contact she was looking for and pressed the call button. She looked up at Blake with an expression that made him take another step backward. "Too late for warnings, Officer Harrison." The phone rang once. Twice. On the third ring, a familiar voice answered. "Attorney General's office, Robert Hayes speaking." Grace put the phone on speaker, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence of the diner. "Bobby, it's Judge Mitchell." The effect was immediate and devastating. Blake's face went from red to white in the span of a heartbeat. Danny's mouth fell open. Frank gripped the counter so hard his knuckles went white. "Your Honor." The Attorney General's voice boomed through the small diner with unmistakable warmth and respect. "What a wonderful surprise. How are you enjoying your sabbatical?" Grace's eyes never left Blake's face as she responded. "Well, Bobby, I've been getting quite an education. Learning what it's like to be on the receiving end of police harassment." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before Hayes spoke again. His tone completely changed. "Your Honor, are you in some kind of trouble?" "I'm standing in Sullivan's diner on 5th Street, Grace continued calmly. "I've just spent the last 20 minutes being verbally abused, physically manhandled, and threatened with arrest by Officers Blake Harrison and Danny Peterson of the local police department." Blake found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. "Judge. You're a judge." Grace held up one finger, silencing him. "They demanded free food, threatened the business owner, and when I declined to comply with their extortion attempt, they decided to arrest me on fabricated charges." "Jesus Christ," Hayes breathed through the phone. "Your Honor, are you safe? Do you need immediate assistance?" Danny had gone so pale he looked like he might faint. "Blake," he whispered urgently, "she's a federal judge. She's a federal judge, and we just—" "I heard what we just did," Blake snapped, but his voice was shaking now. Grace continued her conversation, as if the two officers weren't having nervous breakdowns 3 feet away from her. "I'm safe for the moment, Bobby. But I think you should know that this appears to be part of a systematic pattern of corruption. The business owner has been paying protection money to these officers for months." Frank stepped forward, his fear suddenly replaced by something that looked like hope. "It's true. $500 a month. They threatened to shut me down if I didn't pay." Hayes's voice turned deadly serious. "Your Honor, I need you to stay exactly where you are. I'm dispatching federal marshals to your location immediately." Blake finally seemed to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. Wait. This is all just a misunderstanding. We didn't know." Grace looked at him with the expression she typically reserved for defendants who tried to lie in her courtroom. "Didn't know what, Officer Harrison? That I was a federal judge? Or that extortion and abuse of power are federal crimes regardless of who the victim is?" Danny started backing toward the door. "Blake, we need to get out of here. We need to leave right now." "Nobody's leaving," Grace said firmly. Then to the phone. "Bobby, the younger officer is attempting to flee the scene." "Understood. The marshals are 3 minutes out. Your Honor, I need you to document everything that's happened. Every threat, every demand for money, every abuse of authority." Blake's last shred of composure snapped. "You set us up. This whole thing was a setup." Grace shook her head. "Officer Harrison, I've been working as a waitress in this diner for 3 months because I wanted to understand what ordinary citizens experience in their daily lives. I never intended for this to happen." She gestured around the diner at the frightened customers. "But you couldn't just let it go, could you? You couldn't accept that someone might say no to you. You had to escalate. You had to show everyone in here exactly what kind of officers you really are." Through the phone, Hayes was talking to someone in the background. Grace caught fragments. Federal investigation. Civil rights violations. Immediate response. Danny made another move toward the door, but the elderly customer at the counter suddenly stood up. Son, I wouldn't do that if I were you. Everyone turned to look at the old man, who was now standing straighter than he had all morning. Retired state trooper, 35 years. And if you run from federal marshals, you're going to turn a bad situation into a catastrophic one. Danny froze halfway to the door. Blake was staring at Grace like she was an alien being. A federal judge. You're actually a federal judge. The Honorable Grace Mitchell, United States District Court, Northern District. Hayes's voice came through the phone. 25 years on the bench, nominated by President Clinton, confirmed unanimously by the Senate. Blake sank into the nearest booth, his head in his hands. My career is over. My life is over. Your career should have been over the first time you extorted money from a business owner, Grace replied coldly. Your life isn't over, but your days of abusing innocent people certainly are. The sound of multiple vehicles pulling up outside the diner made everyone turn toward the windows. 3 black SUVs had arrived, and men in tactical gear were already getting out. Danny started hyperventilating. Blake, what do we do? What do we do? Blake looked up at Grace with something that might have been desperation. Judge Mitchell, please. We didn't know. If we had known who you were, you would have behaved differently? Grace interrupted. Officer Harrison, that's exactly the problem. You should treat every citizen with the same respect you would show a federal judge. The diner door opened and 4 federal marshals entered, their weapons drawn but pointed at the floor. The lead marshal, a tall woman with graying hair, approached Grace directly. Your Honor, I'm Deputy Marshal Patricia Williams. Are you injured? I'm fine, Marshal Williams. These are the 2 officers I spoke with Attorney General Hayes about. Grace pointed to Blake and Danny, who were now standing with their hands visible and their faces pale as death. Marshal Williams nodded to her team, and 2 marshals moved to flank the local officers. Officers Harrison and Peterson, you're under federal investigation for civil rights violations. I need you to place your hands on your heads and turn around slowly. Blake started to protest. This is insane. We were just doing our jobs. Your job, Grace said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had presided over thousands of cases, is to serve and protect, not to extort and intimidate. As the marshals began reading Blake and Danny their rights, Grace turned back to her phone. Bobby, they're in custody. Excellent. Your Honor, I need to ask, how extensive is this corruption? Is it just these 2 officers? Grace looked at Frank, who was watching the arrests with a mixture of relief and amazement. Frank, how many other businesses on this street have been paying protection money? Frank's voice was stronger now. All of them, Your Honor. The coffee shop, the hardware store, the flower shop, the barber shop. Everyone's been too scared to report it. Hayes's voice came through the phone like thunder. Your Honor, we're looking at a conspiracy. This is going to require a full federal investigation. Blake, now in handcuffs, turned to Grace with something like hatred in his eyes. You think you're so smart, don't you? You think you've won something here. Grace looked at him with the patience of someone who had dealt with countless criminals trying to justify their actions. Officer Harrison, I think I've reminded you and your partner of something you seem to have forgotten. What's that? Nobody is above the law. Not you, not me, not anyone. Danny was crying now, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. My wife, my kids. What am I going to tell my kids? The retired state trooper at the counter spoke up again. Son, you should have thought about that before you decided to become a criminal. Marshal Williams approached Grace again. Your Honor, we're going to need a full statement from you. And we'll need to interview all the witnesses. Grace nodded, then addressed the other customers in the diner. I apologize for what you've had to witness here today. But I want you to know that what these officers did to me, to Frank, to all of you, it's not acceptable. It's not normal. And it's not something you should ever have to tolerate. The young woman from the corner booth finally spoke up. Your Honor, they've been doing this all over town. Everyone's been afraid to speak up. Well, you don't have to be afraid anymore, Grace replied. Federal investigators will be speaking with anyone who has information about corruption in this police department. Blake was being led toward the door when he stopped and turned back to Grace. You know what the funny thing is? We probably would have just left if you'd given us the free coffee. Grace shook her head. Officer Harrison, that's exactly why this had to happen. Because in your mind, demanding free coffee from struggling business owners is reasonable. Threatening people who say no is justified. And abusing your authority is just part of the job. She stepped closer to him, her voice dropping to a level that only he could hear. You spent 20 minutes telling me I was nobody. That I'd never accomplished anything. That nobody would miss me if I disappeared. Blake looked away, unable to meet her eyes. But here's what you never understood, Grace continued. Every person you've threatened, every business owner you've extorted, every citizen you've intimidated, they all matter. They all deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. She raised her voice so everyone in the diner could hear. And today they got it. As Blake and Danny were led out of the diner in handcuffs, the atmosphere began to change. Frank straightened up behind the counter. The elderly man returned to his newspaper with a satisfied smile. The young couple started talking quietly about what they'd witnessed. Grace turned back to her phone. Bobby, I'm going to need some time to coordinate with your investigators. And Frank here is going to need protection. He's been the primary victim of this extortion scheme. Absolutely, Your Honor. We'll have agents assigned to his security immediately. Frank approached Grace hesitantly. Your Honor, I don't know how to thank you. Grace smiled, the first genuine smile she'd worn all morning. Frank, you don't need to thank me. You've been terrorized by corrupt officers for months. You deserve justice. She looked around the diner at the faces of people who were no longer afraid. All of you deserve justice. Through the windows, they could see Blake and Danny being loaded into the back of federal vehicles. Their careers in law enforcement were over. Their days of intimidating innocent people had come to an end. Grace picked up her phone again. Bobby, there's one more thing. I want to recommend that Frank Sullivan receive some kind of recognition for his courage in coming forward. He could have stayed silent, but he chose to speak up. Frank's eyes filled with tears. Your Honor, I was just trying to keep my diner open. And that, Grace replied, is exactly why what they did to you was so wrong. As the federal vehicles drove away with their prisoners, Grace untied her apron and hung it on the hook behind the counter. Her days as an undercover waitress were over, but her work was just beginning. The phone was still connected to the Attorney General's office. Bobby, I'm going to need a briefing on federal civil rights law. It's been a while since I've prosecuted corruption cases. Hayes laughed. Your Honor, somehow I don't think Blake Harrison and Danny Peterson know what they're up against. Grace looked out the window at the quiet street where businesses had been paying protection money to corrupt cops, where ordinary citizens had been afraid to speak up, where abuse of power had been accepted as normal. No, she said quietly. I don't think they do. The diner was quiet for a moment, and then Frank started the coffee machine. The elderly man ordered another cup. The young couple decided to stay for lunch after all. Life was returning to normal. But it was a new normal, one where corrupt officers were in federal custody, where business owners could operate without fear, and where a federal judge had learned exactly what it felt like to be powerless in the face of injustice. Grace Mitchell had come to this small town to understand how ordinary people lived. She'd learned more than she bargained for. And Blake Harrison and Danny Peterson had just learned that even the most powerless-seeming citizen might not be powerless at all. Justice, as it turned out, sometimes came in the most unexpected packages.